Many mammals have tails, but humans do not. Our ancestors did, but around the same time we started to walk upright and to spend more of our time on the ground than in the trees, these tails began to disappear. And that was a long time ago, tens of millions of years ago, in fact. Some humans, however, carry on our species' rich tradition of tail having and are born with fully grown tails. There have only been 23 recorded cases of this since 1884, when we started keeping track, so it is a very rare occurrence. And that's probably a good thing that it's so rare, because having a tail sounds pretty cool until you learn that these tails are about 12 inches long and lack any real structure or utility, and so they wouldn't actually allow you to hold your mug of coffee or hang from trees. And just think about how difficult it would be to buy pants. And so as a result of their lack of utility, and no doubt because they are considered to be a malformation, these tails, when they show up, have been snipped off by the doctors just after the baby has been born. But although tails are incredibly rare on humans, most of us still have a tailbone, which is an evolutionary remnant of our former full-tailed glory. From stage 14 until stage 22 of our embryonic development, for a period of about 4 weeks, we actually have tails, though as we move further through the process of embryogenesis, this tail disappears, reducing down to a little nub located at the end of our spine called the coccyx. The modern tailbone, the coccyx, still serves as a connection point for some muscles in that region of our bodies, which it is suspected is a big part of why that bone has not disappeared, despite the rest of the tail going away. The coccyx is an example of a vestigial structure, which means a structure like a body part or an organ, which has shrunk down over time because its original function has become unnecessary or even harmful in the evolutionary sense. We lost our tails because we no longer needed them, but we kept the tailbone because it still serves us when we are walking upright. Wisdom teeth in the appendix are other well-known vestigial structures in the human body, though you can also say that a function or behavior is vestigial. Goosebumps, for instance, allowed hairy pre-humans to look bigger by fluffing up their fur when they felt threatened, and it allowed them to increase their insulation capabilities when they were cold by increasing the amount of air that was stored amidst their fur. We still get these bumps when it's cold or when we are surprised or frightened, but lacking impressive body hair, like our ancestors had, we no longer enjoy the change in perceived size or the insulation benefits. Vestigiality is not only found in humans. In the 4th century BCE, Aristotle commented on moles and their horrible eyesight, noting that their eyes were stunted in development. He was right that their eyes were nearly useless, but wrong about the reason. They weren't stunted, they had become vestigial. In 1798, Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, French naturalist and proponent of Lamarckian evolutionary theory, noted that nature doesn't progress rapidly, but slowly, and as a result, she, meaning nature, will often leave vestiges of organs, even when they are completely superfluous. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, of Lamarckian evolutionary theory fame, and Charles Darwin, of Darwinian evolutionary theory fame, both made lists of vestigial organs they found in nature, though there wasn't an official name for this type of structure at that time. Darwin also wrote in his famous work on the origin of the species that vestigial structures might be useless for their original primary function, but could still fill another role, as noted before in the case of the human coccyx. Nearly a century later, in 1983, Robert Weidersheim published a list of 86 vestigial human organs in his book, The Structure of Man. And later versions of this list increased that number to around 180. Interestingly, sometimes structures that disappeared long ago, that became vestigial or even disappeared completely, will reappear in modern descendants of the same genetic lineage. Sometimes this will manifest in chickens as teeth that are clearly unnecessary for a beaked creature. Color blindness in humans is also thought to be atavistic, which is a word that means a trait that was once common in our ancestors, and colorblindness is thought to have been the default mode of seeing back in the day for our ancestors of maybe 30 million years ago, before a gene duplication allowed those mammalian forebears to see a far wider color spectrum. Color blindness would then have fallen out of genetic favor, as it is quite helpful in nature to see more colors in terms of survivability and reproduction. But colorblindness can still reemerge, and it does with some frequency today, a time in which the survival rate of colorblind people and those who can see the full spectrum are about the same. And as a result, there's no huge advantage in one over the other, the way that there used to be in less forgiving times. The same is true of many other traits, many other mutations, both atavistic and those that are seemingly novel innovations biologically. Because of our technologies and our societal structures, our knowledge about health and medicine, more people are capable of surviving and reproducing even if they have what would have been a truly debilitating or deadly condition a mere 100 years ago, not to mention a few thousand or all the way back into prehistory. That means that we're seeing a lot more variety than ever before, and we will likely continue to see a great deal more diversity in everything from neurological archetypes to coccyx girthiness. And that is kind of what I want to talk about today. Evolution, traits, scientific ethics, and pugs. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show, which means it is brought to you by people like you. If you stop by letsknowthings.com, you can click on over to the Contribute page and find an array of different ways that you can help support the show. You can leave a review on iTunes, share it with a friend, you can contribute some money. Each and every effort is very much appreciated. Thank you so much if you've contributed in some way already. And thank you in advance if you are considering doing so in the future. Another great way to help support the show is to check out our sponsors. The first sponsor is HostGator. If you go to hostgator.com/LKT, you will receive a special discount that they provide to listeners of Let's Know Things. If you're looking for any type of hosting from a blog to a great big complex business site, they are an excellent option that I have used for many, many years. HostGator.com/LKT. And the other sponsor today is Audible. If you go to audibletrial.com/LKT, you will receive a free 30-day trial of Audible and a free audiobook of your choice. Stick around till the end of the show, and I will provide a book recommendation if you are looking for something to spend that free credit on. All right, let's get back to the show. The article that I want to start from today is actually kind of more of a letter to the editor that was published in The Guardian recently, back in September of 2016. And it was considered to be such a potential conflict magnet, to be so confrontational, that they actually published it anonymously without any particular person's byline on it. And the title of this piece is Pugs Are Anatomical Disasters. Vets must speak out, even if it's bad for business. And so you can probably see right off the bat why this might be a conflict-prone topic to write about or to discuss, but it serves as a good starting point, I think, for a lot of very relevant and timely topics. And so to start this conversation, let's talk real quick about dogs in general. Modern dogs are the consequence of a very long period of coevolution and interaction with humans. And for a very long time, there have been competing theories bandied about where and when wolves were first domesticated, because wolves are the ancestors of all dog species today. And so the question of where these wolves were domesticated and then where they speciated, where they forked off into dogs as a separate species from wolves. And it's worth noting here that modern wolves are actually significantly different from the wolves of old, the shared ancestor species between modern wolves and modern dogs. But they've changed a bit, and we were unable to determine for a very long time where this might have first happened, where this partnership occurred, and consequently where the speciation of wolves into dogs took place. But recent research, and this is as recent as the end of 2016, indicates that dogs were likely speciated and domesticated at least twice in both Europe and Asia. Scientists are today able to trace genetic lineages backward in time, and it seems that when dogs were first brought over to Europe from Asia, there were already dogs there in Europe amongst the humans ready to breed with these newcomers. And timeline-wise, dogs are thought to have begun working alongside our ancestors somewhere between 30,000 and 10,000 years ago. And while at first that might have meant that they simply followed humans around, eating their scraps, they were eventually trained and began to adopt new human-friendly traits, like bite inhibition, which is the word for the increased ability to control the strength of its bite, which is something that might have otherwise become a problem when they nipped at their human companions. And so at first dogs changed and evolved to be more human-friendly, because those that survived and reproduced most successfully would have been those that were able to most successfully cozy up with the new alpha predators in town. And the benefits of shelter and cooked food would have helped them immensely as well, as would have human tools and weapons, which would have allowed the dogs to indulge in much larger and more varied prey than ever before, which would have increased their likelihood, again, of survival and propagation. Eventually, though, humans began to intentionally breed dogs for traits that they found useful or otherwise preferable. Selective breeding is the term for a process through which dogs or plants or even humans are bred. That is, they are encouraged or forced to reproduce with the intention of achieving a certain trait in the resulting offspring. If you have a big dog and a small dog and they mate, you could end up with a big dog or a small dog. You could end up with any sized offspring. But if two big dogs reproduce, the chances of their puppies being big as well are substantially better. This is a very simple concept and something that takes place in nature already. There are different traits that different species look for in a mate, but generally what they are looking for is a trait that indicates some type of genetic fitness. And so this is us just choosing for different types of traits than they might choose for naturally. But despite being so simple, it's also something that humans have used to great effect. Selective breeding of a grass-like plant genus called Zae, Z-A-E, and in particular a wild species of Zae called teosinte, is how humans essentially invented corn. Teosинtes are grass-like plants that are common in Mesoamerica, and the locals there recognized the value of this tiny little grass with tiny little seed cases spiking out along the top. I will link in the show notes to images that compare the teosinte to modern corn, and the contrast is absolutely ridiculous. You would not ever think in a million years that these two plants were related. The scale is just too far off. But through selective breeding, the early Mesoamericans were able to selectively breed for bigger and bigger kernels over time. And they did this by mating those with larger seeds and those with seeds that grew on the outside of the otherwise naturally hard and dense seed cases, and those with seeds that were sweeter and more plump and edible, with each other. This intentional evolution of what became a staple crop in the region, traditional Mesoamerican maize, is remarkable. That this type of selective breeding is so common in our modern food, yet so unfamiliar to most people, is equally remarkable in a way. All of the produce and meat you can get today is the consequence of selective breeding of some kind. And that's mind-boggling when you think about how long this process can take and the logical leap it would have required for our ancestors to figure this out before we understood even the fundamentals of genetics. Which brings us to pugs. Just like chili peppers and potatoes and corn, the pug is what happens when selective breeding takes us down a very specific genetic alleyway. We want our chilies to be hot or sweet. We want our potatoes to be substantial, perhaps with thicker or thinner skins. And we want our pugs to be tiny and so ugly that they're cute. We want them to look like helpless little babies with old man faces. We want them to be creatures that make grown adults coo uncontrollably. And to that end, the pug is a remarkably successful breed. They have wrinkly little faces and curly little tails and stubby little noses. They're compact and portable. They are sociable, they're friendly but not yippy like some other pocket pooches tend to be. But unfortunately, these winning traits came at a substantial price. And among them, as mentioned in the article, is that little snout of theirs. It's a trait that they share with other brachycephalic, meaning squashed nose, dogs, and a trait that causes them to suffer throughout their entire lives. A quote from the article, quote, "Brachycephalic dogs, which include pugs, bulldogs, French bulldogs, and shih tzus, are an anatomical disaster. Every structure that should make up the nose has been squashed flat. The only time these dogs are not in some degree of respiratory distress is when you have them intubated under anesthetic. I have seen it myself. A bulldog comes in panting away with blue-tinged gums, which is normal for the breed. I anesthetize it and put the tube in, and as if by magic it pinks up and breathes normally. Presumably its body is overjoyed to actually be receiving enough oxygen for once." End quote. This piece, this article, it should be noted, was written in response to a statement by the British Veterinary Association, which urged people to stop buying pugs and other flat-faced breeds. This piece goes on to discuss the difficulty that vets have discussing this topic with dog owners, because if you think about it, who wants to feel like their dog is suffering? And further, who would want to feel like they are supporting an industry that is creating dogs that are born to suffer? Why wouldn't these dog owners, in the face of such implied criticism, this anonymous author asks, simply go to other veterinarians, those who do not make them feel guilty about buying cute little flat-faced doggos? And this is a really difficult question to answer, isn't it? How do you take news like that? If you adopted a rescue pug or shih tzu, I'm guessing it would be a bit different. It would be more about feeling bad for your best friend and that they are suffering than feeling guilty, because after all, the dog is already alive. It's already experiencing whatever it's capable of experiencing. So if you can make that existence a little bit better, you're doing something good for another living creature. But for those owners who bought from a pug breeder, I imagine it's not so straightforward. I'm guessing that most people, if they were to be fully cognizant of the impact these genetic impairments can have on the dog, would not be so enthused about funding an industry that continues to breed them. But I recognize I may be showing my bias there, just as the people who do the breeding don't seem to be too concerned about it. Perhaps those who buy from them are likewise not convinced by the evidence or not moved by what that evidence implies. We all have different responses to this kind of thing. To have this discussion about genetic traits in pugs and things that are alive and potentially suffering, we have to first touch on something that I've discussed at greater length in a past episode, and that is what we know, or what we think we know, about animal consciousness and intelligence and sentience. This is still a developing field, but from what we know thus far, there are only about a dozen or fewer species that are sentient, meaning they have a sense of self and can predict cause and effect and experience things subjectively like a human being does. This is very different from behaving instinctually and feeling pain or primal angst, which is something that most animals do and which we tend to personify, but it is not on the biological level the same thing that we experience. To be sentient, you need to be able to experience the world as an individual separate from it. And as far as we know, right now, by that definition, only creatures like dolphins and elephants and orcas and magpies and a handful of other creatures are sentient. Now you'll notice that dogs are not on that list. This does not mean that they are not sentient and we just can't measure it yet. It doesn't mean that they do not feel or that they do not experience the world in a rich, multifaceted way. It just means that they don't meet the standards that we have set at this point based on our own judgment. That subjectivity and the ability to have a sense of self and distinguish oneself from the rest of the world and to understand things from that standpoint are vital core components of a fully conscious being. Now that said, there is evidence that even things like plants and simple creatures like ants have pain receptors of a sort, and they're able to respond to pain and consequently can be made to suffer, even if in a more what we might call basic or instinctual, purely chemical fashion. The conversation about how we differentiate between different types of pain and suffering is one that is definitely going to continue for a long time, but that is where we stand on the subject now in terms of what we know. But that also, you will notice, does not tell us anything about how to feel on the subject morally. One more thing that's worth noting before we proceed is that a very recent study, which I will link to in the show notes, seems to show that dogs and chimpanzees do seem to have a sense of morality, and that morality or morality-like sensibility seems to prefer social behavior, pack-like behavior, namely treating other people or other creatures well, not being selfish, not being greedy. Dogs and chimps show a statistically significant preference for nice people who demonstrate fairness and helpfulness rather than antisocial behaviors. Now, this is quite possibly why dogs and humans got along so well early on, or it may be a consequence of that partnership over the years that we came to feel similarly about social niceties and fairness and the like. Either way, it could be an important detail to take note of as we are thinking about the human capacity to feel and experience things and how we apply those standards to other animals. So a question that has to be asked, I think, knowing what we know about dogs and how they experience the world, and knowing that pugs in particular suffer from an array of genetic impairments throughout their entire lives, is whether it is ethical to keep breeding them. Is it enough that we simply treat them well after they have been born? Or should something else be done about their very existence to prevent more suffering from occurring in the future? And that by itself is a big question, but I think it also warrants some follow-up questions. For instance, if something should be done about the breeding of pugs, what should be done specifically? Should we have laws against breeding particular breeds of dog? Is that okay? Is it morally correct or morally more correct to make some breeds go extinct while others live on? And those others, by the way, those other breeds, no doubt also have genetic deficiencies, but perhaps not such obvious ones. So is that okay that we have chosen certain genetic deficiencies to focus on and to outlaw? And as a follow-up to that, who decides which genetic properties are the bad ones? Who decides how weird a nose must be before it becomes the wrong kind of nose? The kind that makes us want to snuff out an entire breed. how would we enforce that? Might we end up with a black market full of pug dealers trading adorable, illegal little puppies from alleyways and on the dark web? What would be the fine for breeding pugs? And what happens when we find a pug wandering around but can't locate its owner? What happens to wild pugs, those escaped dogs that still survive and wander around big cities? What do we do about them? And what happens when someone's beloved dog mates with an illegal pug and their offspring is pug-like in the ways that we've decided matter from a legal standpoint? A lot of these questions are quite similar to what animal rights activists have been asking for years, particularly about animals that have been bred to be eaten or milked. Cows and chickens and pigs. These animals today bear very little resemblance to their wild and even early domesticated ancestors. Just like everything else, we have selectively bred them to serve the purposes for which we have found them to be the most useful. But today, in the global economy that we have, we will not starve if a cow is not milked every day. The dairy industry serves a huge customer base, but that doesn't mean that we lack alternatives. And the same is increasingly true of meat. And though it will be a while, I think, before meat substitutes of the kind that meat eaters would be happy with become widespread and cost efficient enough to replace all meat on the market, that day is potentially within view, I think. The products are available, and now we just have to wait for the iteration in quality and availability and in price. So what happens to all these animals when they are no longer necessary for the purposes that they have been optimized for? What happens to the modern cow, which is bred to be milked, and in fact needs to be milked in order not to suffer? What happens to chickens that have been selectively bred to have cartoonishly large breasts and thighs, the better for cutting up and selling by the pound? If we imagine a future in which we've decided that it is entirely immoral to eat animals and to breed animals for the purposes of being eaten, what happens to all these species that, through no fault of their own, now exist with genes that optimize them for a world in which animals are eaten? Do we try to change them back? Do we attempt to forcefully atavize them to bring back their pre-selective breeding attributes? Do we just let them run wild and let nature take its course, despite the fact that that cow needs to be milked, otherwise it will suffer? There is a sanctuary for chimpanzees that have been test subjects in lab experiments. A little over 200 chimps live at this sanctuary, which is in Georgia. Most research animals, though, are euthanized. They're killed after these experiments. They can't be used for other research because the previous tests might mess up their future results, and they cannot be maintained to be allowed to live throughout their natural life because the cost of doing research then would grow commensurately with the number of lab animals that are used. These animals, I think, personally, are heroic in a way, on par with the 57 or so dogs that the Soviet Union sent into space during the space race. They may not be consciously aware of what's happening to them and what risks they are facing, at least not in the same way that we do. But they do essentially take a bullet for us each and every time they're used in an experiment that would otherwise require a human being. And then, afterward, they are killed for their contribution. Now that said, there are excellent arguments to be made in favor of, for example, the breeding of lab mice that are born to develop certain types of cancer. These are animals that are born to die, much like the food animals, which is cruel, but how many lives have they saved? How many human lives have they saved? Likewise, animals that are bred at ranches, they are also born to die and to be eaten. But how much sustenance, how many calories have they provided to the human race as a result? Would we, the human species, be better off testing all of our medicines and procedures on humans first, increasing our own death rate, or, alternatively, massively decreasing our rate of scientific development of medicinal development, which would also, in a different way, massively increase our death rate? Or is it more morally correct to help our own species at the expense of another? At the expense of all of these food animals and all of these mice that we breed to die? Or perhaps is it not morally ideal, but a better option than the alternatives? For some, the way we treat animals is a very clear and undeniable black mark on humanity's moral record sheet. For others, the sacrifices are worth it, though they wouldn't want to do the killing themselves, and they would welcome an alternative option. For still others, it's not a big deal because the differences between species are substantial enough that animal deaths do not register with them the same way human deaths might. A group of humans raised to be killed in this way would be a travesty, but a group of chickens raised for the same reason is just a more efficient extrapolation of how things work in nature anyway. The question of potential life, though, is in many ways even trickier to deal with and even discuss than the relatively straightforward question of life and death. Because we're not just talking about snuffing out life. We're talking about not allowing life to happen, to take actions that prevent new pugs from occurring. And knowing what we know about their genetics, is that better or worse than killing them? It could be argued that it prevents their suffering, but it could also be argued that there is enough joy, or the doggy equivalent of joy, however they experience that, in their lives to make that suffering a worthwhile trade-off. This conversation is not an unfamiliar, novel conversation when it comes to humans, by the way. The abortion debate is troublesome because for some, not following through in creating potential life is horrible. It's sacrilegious. The Catholic Church has gone so far as to ban birth control. The thinking being that if you keep a child from being created, even when nothing has happened yet, no egg has been fertilized, nothing has combined with anything else that might turn into life, but you're still preventing potential life from manifesting by not allowing that possible convergence to maybe happen. Sex with birth control, by this logic, is tantamount to killing a child, because you have prevented a child that could have come into existence if that birth control had not been present. We've also, at times, had similar conversations as societies when we have discussed eugenics and similar programs. Eugenics is a term that refers to plans and systems that help selectively breed the human population so that we end up with better genes. The trouble is, which are the good and which are the bad genes varies based on who you ask. At times, the proponents of eugenics have decided that most ideally we don't have any black or brown people, or no Jews, or no poor people, or no one with any physical deformities like missing arms or bad eyesight. The downsides of this type of system are many. And I bring this up to note that although we sometimes selectively breed our way from grass to corn, which is awesome, but at other times we accidentally end up with Nazis. And if you want to get Nazis, eugenics is how you get Nazis. Sometimes selective breeding works well, sometimes it does not. And it's difficult to know which it will be until later, until after we have done the selective breeding for a while. And much of the time, while we are doing the selective breeding, we are also blinded by contemporary bias and perspectives, which leaves us unable to see the most likely potential negative consequences of, for example, getting rid of the pug, or, on the flip side, the potential negative consequences of not getting rid of the pug. I often find myself struggling with this topic, whether we're talking about dogs or any other species, because I want humanity and all life forms in general to experience joy and fulfillment, whatever that happens to mean for them. I want us all to be happy, to be healthy, and to live as long as we each might want. And to get there, chances are, we are going to need to better understand our genes. And maybe at some point, we're going to need to start stripping embryos of genes that cause particularly debilitating conditions. I very much think that in order to reach our full potential, we are going to need to alter ourselves, to evolve ourselves in some way. I worry, though, that we will be just as prone to misfiring this weapon as we always have been. While it may seem obvious that being unable to take a full breath for your entire life is a bad thing, it is less clear what to think about dogs with non-standard bone structures, which makes walking a terribly difficult thing for them, but which has made them lighter and which has resulted in different doggy habits. Might we accidentally cull out a trait that might lead in the future to a beneficial evolution? An evolution that will not be clear for maybe 3 or 4 more steps down the evolutionary line? Might we remove seemingly negative traits before they have the chance to become useful, like wings or fins or sentience? Might we strip away something good but young, not recognizing its future potential due to our own inability to predict what traits might be beneficial in the future? It is very likely that pre-humans without tails were considered to be crazy freaks up in the old mammalian tree, at least for a while. But look at where that took us. Had those creatures, rightfully by their own standards, killed off all of our upright walking tailless ancestors, humanity may never have come to be. How could they have predicted where those seemingly bizarre mutations would lead us? And another question on that same topic, if we reach the point where we are able to eliminate negative genetic conditions in humans while they are still in the womb, might it eventually become illegal to not use this technology? Would you be seen as a monster and incapable of responsibly raising a child for not taking such a step if you knew that your baby would be born disabled or deformed without it? Or how about for ourselves? If we develop the technology to change ourselves and it becomes common to adjust our genes however we see fit, who would decide which changes we are allowed to make to our own bodies and which are off limits? Who will be in charge of determining if the genetic adjustments that we want, the stumpy snout maybe, or the skin that will be more prone to cancers but which we like the aesthetics of, will be legal? We have a lot to think about. I think many of us already have knee-jerk reactions to some of these questions. I know I do. And ideas about which morals apply to which situations, while at the same time holding diametrically opposite reactions to other questions that are incredibly similar and perhaps even represent the same situation, but in regards to a different species or a different genetic trait or a different very specific set of circumstances. Consistency in these matters will be key, I think, but it will also be immensely difficult to maintain. We are going to need better data, which will help us understand how different creatures experience the world, but we're also importantly going to need well-developed personal morals and societal ethics to help guide us, to help us understand what that data means on a practical level, to help us decide how to use it. It's one thing to understand that some creatures are more capable of psychological trauma than others, but does that mean we should feel okay about inflicting purely physical pain on those which cannot? How about on those creatures that don't even have long-term memories that are capable of remembering the pain? These are the kinds of questions that we are going to need to answer. And as with most things involving technology and science and research, having these discussions now is already useful, but it will become even more so as time goes by. We should be having them now as an investment before we are capable of doing what we are going to be capable of doing in the coming years. Having the discussions now and the contentious debates that we will no doubt have on these subjects as well beforehand will allow us to better understand where we stand personally and societally on these issues, and hopefully come up with consistent ideologies and regulations. before we have any reason to start applying them. This episode of Let's Know Things was brought to you by listeners like you. Pop on over to letsknowthings.com, click on the contribute page, and you will find myriad options of how you can help support the show. You can share the show with a friend who you think might enjoy it, or share it on social media. And then you can also contribute directly monetarily through things like PayPal, Venmo. All of those links are available on that contribute page at letsknowthings.com. A huge thanks to everyone who has already contributed in some way. Thank you very much. I appreciate you. Another great way to help support the show is to check out our sponsors. The first sponsor is Audible. If you go to audibletrial.com/LKT, you will receive a free month Audible membership and a free audiobook of your choice from their vast collection, which is great because if you enjoy podcasts, chances are you will enjoy audiobooks. They are just epically long podcasts. And a really wonderful audiobook that I listened to recently through Audible is one that I would highly recommend spending that credit on if you are looking for an excellent book to indulge in. It's entitled Consider the Fork, and it's by the author B. Wilson. And what it is essentially a history book presented through the lens of cooking and cooking tools. And it is a really lovely combination of a deep dive into cooking and what cooking has looked like over the years throughout recorded human history. But it also includes a great deal of information about what that means for the times. And so the different tools that we used, how that helped shape society, and how society helped shape those tools. And so I learned a whole lot about the trappings of aristocratic society and how relatively modern the overbite is. It's apparently the direct result of diets that we have been eating for about 200 years or so. Little tidbits like that, little bits of information with a really well integrated and well described and beautifully narrated timeline of the history of cooking tools. Consider the Fork by B. Wilson, an excellent book to check out, whether you want to grab it at your local library, your local indie bookstore. You can get it on your Kobo, your Kindle, but you can also go to audibletrial.com/LKT, snag yourself that free audiobook credit, and get the audiobook version of this for free. Another great way to support the show, if you have any shopping for anything to do on Amazon, is to go to letsknowthings.com/Amazon, and that will take you to Amazon, but it will include my affiliate code, which essentially means that anything that you buy, it won't cost you anything extra, but I will get a small percentage of that fee. So that's another great way to help support the show if you have any type of shopping to do, not just book shopping, but also very much including book shopping if you're looking for an excuse to buy some more books. And the other sponsor today is HostGator. If you go to hostgator.com/LKT, you'll find a bunch of different options for your blog or your portfolio site, your business site, whatever you might need online related. They have it, and they will give it to you at a discount, which they provide to listeners of Let's Know Things. HostGator.com/LKT for all of your hosting needs. You will not be disappointed. If you want to find out more about me or find a complete list of the books that I have written, you can go to colin.io. You can also find me all over the internet at Colin is my name. My blog can be found at exilelifestyle.com. And if you want to check out the copious show notes for this episode or any episode of Let's Know Things, you can go to letsknowthings.com and check those out. Thank you so much for listening. I am Colin Wright, and I will talk to you again next week.